That icky, sticky stuff is only fit for Heffalumps and Woozles.
You mean elephants and weasels?
That's what I said, Heffalumps and Woozles.
Winnie the Pooh, the lovable bear of very little brain, was created by A. Milne in 1924. At that point, he was called Edward Bear, named for his son's teddy bear. His son, Christopher Robin, grew fond of a bear named Winnipeg at the London Zoo, and renamed Edward Winnie the Pooh. Pooh became the subject of 2 books, Winnie the Pooh and The House at Pooh Corner. In those stories, he lived in the 100-acre wood with characters like Piglet and Eeyore, many of them based on Christopher's other toys. The world of Pooh was a pleasant one. Many of the conflicts that arose were based on simple misunderstandings, and resolved fairly quickly. Rabbit would sometimes do something a bit underhanded, or Tigger would carelessly bounce into others, but that was really it. Pooh's biggest concern was how much honey he could stomach. And what does a honey-loving bear fear the most? Something that could potentially take his honey away. Today we're talking about Heffalumps and Woozles, fearsome creatures that are well known for stealing honey. Except not quite. The Heffalumps and Woozles in Milne's stories were not necessarily honey thieves, nor did they even appear together. Technically, they never truly appeared at all. In one chapter of the first book, Christopher Robin mentions seeing a heffalump. This gets Pooh and Piglet thinking. Pooh decides he wants to catch one. Why? Why not? To catch a heffalump, they'll need to set a trap. They dig a large pit and then try to come up with bait. Piglet initially thinks of using acorns, since that's what he likes. Pooh, for the same reason, suggests honey. Honey it is, says Piglet, happy to not have to sacrifice any of his acorns. Pooh soon regrets leaving his honey jar in the trap, and is plagued by nightmares of countless heffalumps indulging in his food. The next morning, Piglet checks on the trap to find a heffalump inside. No, it's actually Pooh, who has gone to retrieve his honey pot and gotten it stuck on his head. In the second book, Pooh and Piglet fall into their own trap sometime later. They have a vague recollection of digging a heffalump trap, but mistakenly think this is a trap that a heffalump set for them. To their relief, the supposed heffalump never passes by. Woozles, meanwhile, are only mentioned in the first book. An early chapter has Pooh and Piglet following their own footprints in the snow. They believe they're tracking a woozle, and possibly a whizzle. In the chapter where the 100-acre wood floods, Pooh dreams he's exploring the East Pole. He stays in a beehive, leaving his legs exposed for wild woozles to come and steal his fur for their nests. Other mysterious creatures mentioned include jaguars, which apparently hide in the treetops and drop down on their prey. Another chapter has Christopher Robin leave a note telling everyone he'll be back soon. He's misspelled a few words, leading Owl and Rabbit to believe he's doing something with a creature called a Baxen. The non-existent Heffalumps and Woozles fit nicely into Milne's gentle stories. As we will see, although Disney tried to make them a bit more sinister, they didn't overstep too much, since most of the time, they still only exist in the characters' imaginations. When Walt Disney adapted Pooh, he was initially unsure if American audiences would take to the bear. The first short, 1966's Winnie the Pooh and the Honey Tree, tried to steer things in a slightly wackier direction. Pooh has a slapstick chase sequence with the bees, and Gopher was added as a distinctly American character. Winnie the Pooh and the Blustery Day, released in 1968, was a bit closer to Milne's books. Piglet and Tigger were introduced, and although there was still plenty of whimsical fun to be had, it felt a bit more restrained in tone. The one time the animators truly let loose was Pooh's Nightmare. About halfway through the short, Tigger talks about the dreaded Heffalumps and Woozles. All we know about these creatures is that they steal honey, and that is certainly enough to put Pooh on guard. Being a bear of very little brain, it never occurs to Pooh that he's a honey thief himself, directly trying to steal it from the bees. Of course, in Pooh's mind, Heffalumps and Woozles seem to exist only to steal honey. Storyboards for this scene tell us there's originally going to be more information given about the creatures. They prowl around on dark, blustery nights and can smell honey from miles away. Armed with his trusty pop gun, Pooh patrols his honey pots and eventually falls asleep. A psychedelic dream sequence follows, full of these horrible, strange creatures that Pooh has just learned about. Not only do Heffalumps and Woozles come in all shapes and sizes, but they can actually transform themselves at will. And they don't just try to steal honey, they also get a kick out of tormenting Pooh. This scene is essentially a lighter version of the nightmarish pink elephant scene from Dumbo. However, even though it's less scary, I'll admit a few parts did creep me out as a kid. Something about that dancing heffalump couple really rubbed me the wrong way. Years later, I realized that part of the section's unnatural feeling is because they reverse the animation halfway through. You can even see honey dripping upwards if you look closely. Creepy or not, some of the softened tone is owed to how the characters look. The original Heffalump illustrations look like actual elephants. Disney's take on the Heffalumps and Woozles makes them look like stuffed animals, much like Pooh Bear himself. Around the time the short was released, Sears even put out some adorable plushes of the characters. Who wouldn't want a snake charmer Woozle? Not only did the Nightmare introduce Heffalumps and Woozles, but it also served as a benchmark for Disney's Pooh franchise. Many later entries, TV specials, episodes, and movies, would often feature a trippy, surreal fantasy. Sometimes devious creatures would be present, and sometimes not, but I feel like none of these sequences would exist if not for this first one. Pooh's troubles are far from over when he wakes up. The 100-acre wood has been hit by a flash flood. However, his honey is safe, so everything is mostly in order. This was all we saw of the creatures for a while. The honey thieves were confined to Pooh's nightmares and Tigger's tall tales. It took until 1988 to reveal that Heffalumps and Woozles did in fact exist, and to Pooh's dismay, they did steal honey. The New Adventures of Winnie the Pooh was an animated series that took Pooh to the world of Saturday morning television. Sometimes the adventures got downright off the wall and resembled nothing that Pooh and friends had ever done before. Other times, the situations and dialogue did a surprisingly good job of matching Milne's original stories. The episodes featuring Heffalumps and Woozles are generally in the former category. The most villainous ones were Stan the Woozle, voiced by Ken Sansom, and Heff the Heffalump, voiced by Chuck McCann. They're honey thieves and proud of it. They only appeared in 2 episodes, although both were memorable. The first one had them pull off several honey thefts, only for Roo to stop them. Heff, being an elephant, or at least elephant adjacent, is terrified of mice. In classic cartoon tradition, he mistakes Roo for an oversized mouse and goes to pieces. Undeterred, Stan calls on Wooster, the only thing Heff fears more than mice. Wooster, voiced by Peter Cullen, turns out to be the world's biggest woozle. Since the 100-acre wood characters are mostly supposed to be toys, we can only wonder where and why something as large as Wooster was created. His craving for honey seems to be even stronger than Pooh's. Pooh, in his own gentle wisdom, actually manages to make friends with Wooster and offers to share honey, something the Woozle never considered. By the end of the episode, the gang has a giant Woozle on their side. Wooster was never seen again, but Stan and Heff appeared once more. Their new plan to steal honey involved ransoming Rabbit's surrogate daughter, Kessie. Being a Pooh story, things got a little out of hand, and after a bit of confusion, the thieves found themselves outwitted by a little bird. Sometimes honey just isn't worth the trouble. A little more unusual is a Heffalump family encountered in a couple episodes. Little Junior Heffalump, voiced by Patricia Paris, is innocent as they come. He quickly befriends Piglet, who is pleasantly surprised to meet a nice Heffalump. His mother, also voiced by Paris, is the usual doting parent archetype, along the same lines as Kanga. Papa Heffalump, meanwhile, is another story. Voiced by Jim Cummings, the absent-minded father is chiefly concerned with getting back his house. Tigger dismantled it, thinking it was firewood. In this case, Tigger is the one in the wrong. He does display a strong fondness for honey, as does everyone in the 100-acre wood, but Papa Heffalump never makes an attempt to actually steal any. It's his second appearance where things get slightly more sinister. Papa is teaching Junior to track and trap woodland creatures, meaning Pooh and friends. Since it's only an 11-minute episode, there's never any real reason given why he wants to catch them. It seems like he's operating more on some strange, forgotten Heffalump instinct, rather than common sense. Junior only half understands what they're doing for most of the episode, and doesn't like the idea of hurting his friends when he realizes that's the goal. Luckily, the trap malfunctions, and absent-minded Papa doesn't seem all that bothered. I'm still left scratching my head at this one. Confusion about Papa Heffalump aside, Junior almost felt like a wasted opportunity at a friendly Heffalump. Until 2005. Pooh's Heffalump movie revisited this idea with a new character, Lumpy the Heffalump, voiced by Kyle Stanger. When Heffalump tracks are spotted in the woods, Pooh and friends regale Roo with horror stories about what the monsters are like. This is all accompanied by a trippy musical sequence, again drawing from the original Nightmare. Roo thinks Heffalumps sound fun rather than scary. Although everyone scoffs at this, he ends up being right. Lumpy is merely a lost child, and proves to be a lot of fun. After the usual bit of conflict, he becomes a well-liked member of the 100-acre wood. I do have the same questions I had about Wooster in regards to Lumpy's mother, voiced by Brenda Blethyn. She's closer to the size of an actual elephant. Even the other Heffalumps we see at the end of the movie are roughly the size of an adult human. Who's making these toys? Friendly variations on these species also appeared in 2 of the TV shows from the 2000s. The Book of Pooh featured an episode where Piglet dreams of Heffalumps. For once, the dream is actually a pleasant one, with the Heffalumps just needing something to keep their feet warm. Piglet knits them socks and earns their gratitude. My Friends Tigger and Pooh had a few episodes where the characters try to find some Woozles. Both times, we only get hints that the Woozles are out there. One of them is about a search for the legendary Woozle Wizard who can grant wishes. At the end, Pooh finds his honey has been mysteriously replenished, something he wished for. We catch a glimpse of a Cheshire Cat-like face smiling from the darkness. Apparently, the Woozle Wizard is a pretty nice guy. The most recent mention of these characters was in 2018's Christopher Robin. The movie follows the adult Christopher as he learns to reconnect with his childhood. When he returns to the Enchanted Woods, most of his stuffed friends mistake him for a Heffalump. At one point, he has what appears to be a hallucination of some sort in the flooded Heffalump trap. Through the murky water, we can glimpse an actual Heffalump, drawn to look like the original E.H. Shepard illustrations. Woozles, meanwhile, are linked to Christopher Robin's slimy boss Winslow, played by Mark Gatiss. Pooh mishears his name as Woozle and continuously refers to him as such. By the end of the movie, due to Winslow's mismanagement, Christopher agrees with Pooh that Winslow is indeed a Woozle. It's not hard to find Pooh and friends in the theme parks. Every version of the Magic Kingdom, minus Paris, has a Winnie the Pooh dark ride. The versions found in Florida, California, Hong Kong, and Shanghai are all very similar. Generally following the Blustery Day short, they all contain an extended sequence set in Pooh's dreamscape. Over in Tokyo, Pooh's Honey Hunt features an even more elaborate dream. The trackless ride allows guests to careen through Pooh's honey-fueled psyche. The best detail is a family of Heffalump and Woozle tourists drifting around in their own ride vehicle. There have been a few walk-around versions of the characters, dating back to their first appearance, but they seem to be generally regulated to parades and special events. Disneyland's Flights of Fantasy parade in the 80s had inflatable Heffalumps and Woozles, accompanied by a walking honeypot. Years later, a parade by the same name in Hong Kong had an entire Heffalump and Woozle float. Another float appeared in Tokyo Disneyland's Dreaming Up parade. There could be more out there, but a guy can only look through so many international Disney parades. While there have been plenty of Pooh comics over the years, the honey-stealing monsters have not been a big part of them. Heffalumps, from what I found, have only been alluded to and appeared very briefly in fantasy or dream scenes. Since there are a few Pooh video games, it makes sense that the honey thieves would show up as enemies. Their biggest role was in Piglet's Big Game. The game has Piglet traveling into his friends' dreams to solve various problems. Along the way, nightmare visions of Heffalumps and Woozles block his path. Piglet must summon his courage and scare them before they can scare him. Just like in the cartoons, the monsters come in every shape and size, but Piglet manages to hold his own against them. At several points, a grouchy door serves as an obstacle. Voiced by Michael Goff, he's the only enemy to directly speak to Piglet. The rest of the bad guys just grunt and growl. In TIGGER'S Honey Hunt and Winnie the Pooh's RUMBLY TUMBLY Adventure, the monsters are fought in the real world of the 100-Acre Wood. Well, it's as real as an enchanted neighborhood can be. The point is, Pooh and friends are awake this time. We have yet to have a Heffalump or Woozle fight in any of the Kingdom Hearts games. The only Heffalump to appear in any of them is Lumpy in Kingdom Hearts 3, friendly as ever. Beyond Heffalumps and Woozles, the Pooh franchise has had a few other villains, spookables, and rather unfriendly creatures. Most of them were featured in the New Adventures of Winnie the Pooh. Rabbit was regularly plagued by crows and little green bugs. While these pests could be devious, they were generally more of a nuisance than a real threat. A group of larger, meaner crows appeared in one episode, but most of the time they were harmless. And again, Pooh and friends have tried to steal honey from bees plenty of times, so sometimes it just depends on your perspective. The Pack Rats, all voiced by Frank Welker, were a trio of rodents that were the best thieves in the 100-Acre Wood. They could give the Heffalumps and Woozles a run for their money, but they didn't focus on honey alone. The kleptomaniacs steal anything and everything, except they don't actually view it as stealing. They always leave a walnut as payment. The rats aren't truly bad, just very confused. In one episode, Pooh takes them in after their lair floods. In order to repay him, they steal pots and pans from everyone else to help Pooh's leaky roof. When Pooh tries to explain that friends give each other things, the rats steal all his things and give them to Piglet. By the end of the episode, they seem to have learned their lesson for the most part. When they appear once more, they're up to the usual tricks, but they seem to have a better understanding with Pooh and the others. Getting into more traditional villainy, we have Nasty Jack, voiced by Jim Cummings. The leader of a gang of literal horse thieves, Jack appeared in a Western-themed play the gang put on. This was an excuse to put everyone in a distinctly different setting. Piglet is unwittingly made sheriff by a group of fleeing prairie dogs. You see, Jack hates sheriffs, and has made it his duty to trounce whoever's wearing the sheriff's badge. Although Pooh and Eeyore put up a valiant fight as the masked bear and his faithful steed, it is ultimately Piglet who must face Nasty Jack in a showdown. In a typically wholesome outcome, Piglet's badge comes off. Now that he's no longer sheriff, Jack can't trounce him. Piglet gently suggests that Jack be sheriff himself. Nasty no more, Jack loves the idea and instantly reforms. As you can see, most antagonists in the New Adventures series either aren't really villainous or reform by the end. One of the only characters who was unrepentantly evil was Crud, also voiced by Jim Cummings. If you thought the Western episode was weird, buckle up. Like most little boys, Christopher Robin hates cleaning his room. Encouraged by Tigger, he throws all his clutter under his bed. This ends up empowering Crud, a huge slime monster who appears to have been building up for the past 3 years or so. Crud handles himself in classic villain fashion. He craves world domination, or at least to make the world as dirty as possible, and he even has his own psychopathic little sidekick, a dustball named Smudge, yet again voiced by Cummings. It's all your typical cartoon villain stuff, but it feels very odd in a Pooh cartoon. Crud has enslaved many of Christopher Robin's toys. Some of them are unwilling, but his army of crayons seems to be pretty happy to serve their grimy master. All turns out well in the end, but if I was Christopher Robin, I'd get some new crayons, just to be safe. Up next we have the Baxen. Well, more or less. As I mentioned in the first section, the idea of a Baxen is from the house at Pooh Corner. That chapter was adapted twice. The first was from the surprisingly somber Pooh's Grand Adventure movie. Owl misreads a note that Christopher Robin leaves about going to school as going to Skull. Skull, according to Owl, is the most dangerous place in the world, home to the dreaded Skullosaurus. Of course, there is no Skullosaurus. The growling the gang hears throughout their adventure is just Pooh's eternally rumbly-tumbly. The 2011 Winnie the Pooh movie adapts the Baxen note a bit more directly, combining it with a chapter about the Heffalump trap. In this version, Owl declares the Baxen to be a monstrous creature. Not only has it, according to Owl, taken Christopher Robin, but is responsible for just about everything he and his friends dislike. The gang's attempt to trap it in a pit results in them all getting stuck themselves. As a final gag, the Baxen does appear at the very end. Voiced by Huell Hauser, he's actually very nice. Finally, we have the most obscure Pooh villain. This is one I was on the fence about whether or not to include, since I still don't know if he even qualifies as a Disney character. For the full story on this one, check out my video on the Pooh for President campaigns that were staged over the years. To sum it up, Pooh has run for president multiple times. The first event had a locally produced TV special that aired in Florida. In Pooh's Adventures of the Electoral College, Winnie the Pooh was pitted against Rodney the Rotten Wolf. Rodney stood for the opposite of Pooh's ideals. He hated bears, honey, children, and fun. He wasn't above cheating to secure votes either. The special was sponsored by Sears, who was selling official Disney Pooh merchandise. Most likely, the Disney company had to sign off on the use of Pooh, but Rodney seems like he was created by someone outside of Disney. I would not be surprised if he was a repurposed school mascot or something. He's a footnote, but a darn interesting one. This has certainly been an unusual entry. It feels like most of the characters I've talked about this time have either reformed, are merely misguided, or just aren't all that bad to begin with. It's actually very appropriate for a franchise like Winnie the Pooh. Pooh represents the most innocent parts of our childhood. Back before we were fully aware of the problems in the world. Back when the worst thing you had to fear was some imaginary monsters stealing your honey. Now don't get me wrong. Characters like Stan, Heff, Nasty Jack, and Crud are fondly remembered by fans, myself included. Their episodes were a lot of fun. But for the most part, Pooh doesn't really need villains. He's ended up befriending many of the characters on this list. It's why Crud felt so out of left field as the only genuinely bad guy. Winnie the Pooh and friends exist in a much nicer plane of reality. If the world was a little more like the 100-Acre Wood, perhaps we'd all be happier. In our next entry, we'll be looking at Edgar, the unfortunate butler from the Aristocats. In his defense, he has a few more fans than I thought.